On July 8th, 2022, chaos broke out on a street in the city of Nara, Japan. It was late in the morning. A man lay on the street in a state of cardiac arrest, bleeding from 2 wounds to his neck. Red spread across his white shirt. Panic was in the air. 2 men wrestled with the attacker while concerned bystanders tried to revive the man bleeding on the ground. The rest could only look on in horror. It was murder, pure and simple. But what no one expected was what came next. This one attack would end up prying open a Pandora's box, revealing shocking truths that had been hidden for decades. Truths that crossed borders, leading to a religious organization based in South Korea. Today, we will be discussing the Unification Church. On the street in the city of Nara, Japan, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was giving a campaign speech. He was a political heavyweight, the longest-serving prime minister in Japanese history. A large crowd had gathered to hear him speak. Everything seemed to be going fine. Until a man walked off the sidewalk into the road, holding a gun that he'd constructed using metal pipes, wooden boards, and duct tape. The gun itself looked like the stuff of school art projects, but it could fire 6 bullets at a time, and it proved to be deadly. He fired his first shot at Abe. According to police, the time that passed between the shooter stepping off the sidewalk and firing his gun was just 9.1 seconds. He missed, but he was determined. He fired his second shot just 2.6 seconds after that. Abe was struck twice in the neck with 1 gunshot wound deep enough to reach his heart. He would not survive. A former head of state had been assassinated in broad daylight. The shooter, Tetsuya Yamagami, was arrested immediately at the scene. Naturally, everyone's attention turned to the question of why he did it. The assassination of a politician would suggest a political motive, but the explanation that emerged from the police investigation left everyone baffled. He was motivated by a personal grudge against the Unification Church, officially known as the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification. Yamagami told investigators that his mother had donated an enormous amount of money to this church, and that it had completely destroyed his family. And he believed Abe was a central figure in the relationship between the Unification Church and the political establishment of Japan. In other words, he saw Abe as one of the high-ranking politicians who protected and promoted the church. So what was this family ruin he described? Based on his statements, the Japanese media relayed a disturbing story dating back to the late 1990s. Yamagami's mother inherited a house and a construction company from her parents. It was worth several $100,000 US. But in the space of just 6 months, she sold all of it. And according to Yamagami, she had donated every penny to the Unification Church. It was a fortune gone in an instant, and the fallout was brutal. A few years later, the family couldn't even cover the rent on their apartment. Eventually, his mother went bankrupt, and things fell apart when he was in his early 20s. And that's when one emotion started to grow inside him: a hatred for the Unification Church. He blamed the church for destroying his life. That hatred kept growing for more than 20 years. And eventually, that twisted hatred turned toward Abe, a politician with ties to the church. And so he murdered Abe in the street. The crime was committed, the perpetrator was caught, and the motive had been revealed. You'd expect that to be the end of the story. And yet, it was just the start. The shots Yamagami fired became the force that pushed a massive problem up to the surface. And that problem was the Unification Church's enormous demands for donations. As the Japanese government launched a full-scale investigation into the church, victims started coming forward, one after another. And what this case revealed was a truth on a scale almost impossible to imagine. The amount of damage the government identified came to a staggering 20.4 billion Japanese yen, which amounts to around 140 million US dollars. And the victims' testimonies all sounded eerily alike. They sold their houses, their land, some had even gone into debt just to make sure they could keep giving to the church. Over and over, people described being pressured into donating with the promise of salvation. What happened to Yamagami's family was anything but rare. One tactic in particular gained attention. It was a method known as spiritual sales, the practice of using religion as a pretext to push overpriced goods on people. Claiming to ease the grievances of your ancestors or to ward off bad luck, the church would demand expensive items or large donations. A Japanese court ruled that this behavior had been carried out in an organized and deeply malicious way for years. So where did all that money go? And this is where a shocking fact comes to light. A large share of the donations collected in Japan was believed to have been sent to Korea. One former church insider told Japanese media that the annual donation target was somewhere around 30 billion Japanese yen, roughly 200 million US dollars. And that part of it, he understood, was being sent to Korea. The scale was far beyond anything most people imagined. According to a report compiled by the legal team representing Japanese victims, between 1999 and 2011, around 7.2 trillion Korean won, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 billion US dollars, was sent to Unification church-affiliated foundations in Korea. And who are these people giving to the church? Well, the exact number of Unification church members isn't publicly known, but according to people familiar with the inner workings of the organization, the church had an estimated 20,000 members in Korea. The base in Japan is even bigger, reportedly about 10 times that. And the members' combined annual donations were said to reach hundreds of millions of US dollars. And the largest share of all came from Japanese members. And there's a core doctrine that drives all this giving. It's called the restoration of all things. The idea that every nation, every religion, all wealth, every single thing in the world must ultimately return to the Unification Church. Religious scholars have described this doctrine as, in effect, a form of exploitation. The belief that all the world's wealth must return to the church became the justification that kept members donating endlessly. In fact, an account from one church missionary was chilling. Members were made to list everything they owned on a written pledge: their cars, their homes, any buildings they owned, even land, such as rice paddies and fields, needed to be included. The stated reason was that ownership had to be transferred to the church. With a doctrine requiring everything to return to the church, members found it nearly impossible to stop giving, even when they could barely afford to. They feared that they wouldn't be saved if they stopped. They felt the pressure of the members watching around them. Layer after layer of pressure kept people trapped in a cycle of giving. And with the members giving up the things they owned, one by one, it all amounted to the church building an enormous amount of wealth. About a year after the shooting, the Japanese government finally made its move. The Ministry of Education convened a religious corporation review board and officially announced that it would petition the courts to dissolve the Unification Church. They argued that the church was taking organized, malicious, illegal action under the cover of religion. And in the years that followed, the courts agreed. A Tokyo court ordered for the church to be dissolved, and in June 2026, Japan's Supreme Court made it final. The church lost its standing as a religious corporation, along with the tax benefits that came with it, and a court-supervised process began liquidating its asset to compensate victims. Members could still believe and still practice their faith, but the organization itself had been stripped of its legal shield. The church fought the whole way, at one point submitting a petition signed by over 50,000 members. But let's take a moment to look at things in Korea, the original home of the Unification Church. And at the top of that church is one person, Chairwoman Han Hak-ja. Hanakja reportedly entered the orbit of the church because her mother was a follower. It was through the church that she came to meet its founder, Moon Sunmyeong. The two were said to have first met when Han was 14. And in 1960, when she was just 17, they were married. Moon was 23 years her senior. Together, they had 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters. And after Moon's death, Han rose to become the #1 figure in the church, standing at the very top of a massive religious organization with a history spanning more than 70 years. But Han doesn't just call herself a leader. She calls herself the only begotten daughter. The term is said to mean the firstborn daughter of God, born without original sin. According to one religious scholar, Han claims to be the savior, the returning Messiah, God incarnate. Members followed her, calling her the true mother. And the church she built into a global movement is a vast kingdom. It has huge real estate holdings in Seoul's Yeouido district, companies in food and construction, and more. And that's just the start. It has ballet troupes and choirs, schools at every level, and media outlets in Korea and abroad, all run directly or indirectly by the church. And what funded this enormous kingdom was, of course, the members' donations. But this wasn't without consequence. The way that money was collected inflicted real suffering, and at the center of it was something called ancestral liberation. The church teaches that you must resolve the lingering grievances of your ancestors, and the scope of that, supposedly, reaches 430 generations back on both your mother's and father's sides. To liberate every last one of those ancestors, you'd need hundreds of millions of Korean won or hundreds of thousands of US dollars. The account from one second-generation member, that is, a member born into the church, was heartbreaking. His family was poor enough to be on government assistance, and yet his mother gave the church more than 700,000 Korean won, or around 500 US dollars, in exchange for ancestral liberation. It was money she'd scraped together one bill at a time. She could barely afford to buy underwear, but the donations were the one thing she couldn't stop. And the problem was that this kind of giving never ended with a single payment. After Han took power, new categories of donations reportedly kept appearing. One second-generation member bought an item meant to soothe an ancestor's restless spirit for 4 million Korean won, which is around 3,000 US dollars. But that wasn't the end of it. He was then told a spirit was clinging to his body and was asked for still more money to have it removed. The suffering of the second generation ran especially deep. A core teaching of the Unification Church is that salvation is completed through the family. Okay, to understand how a person could give away a house, a business, everything they owned, and still feel they haven't given enough, you have to understand what this church actually teaches. Because underneath the donations sits a belief system unlike almost anything else in the religious world. And the clearest window into it is the church's most famous ritual, the mass wedding. So picture a stadium. Tens of thousands of couples, all dressed identically, the men in dark suits and red ties, the women in matching white gowns and veils, standing shoulder to shoulder, row after row, stretching back as far as the eye can see. At the front, one man raises his hand, and in a single moment, all of them are married at once. The church calls these blessing ceremonies. The very first, in 1961, joined just 36 couples. But the numbers exploded. In 1997, the church's founder, Moon Sunmyeong, blessed around 30,000 couples at a stadium in Washington, D.C. 2 years later, some 21,000 filled the Olympic Stadium in Seoul. And in 2009, the church claimed that 40,000 couples were married simultaneously across 4 countries: Korea, the United States, Brazil, and Venezuela, linked together by satellite. But here's the part that stunned the outside world. For decades, the couples didn't choose one another. Moon paired them himself, often from nothing more than a photograph. And he did it deliberately across nationalities and languages. A Japanese member matched with a Korean, an American matched with someone whose language they didn't share. Many of these couples met only days before they stood together in that stadium. Some couldn't exchange a single sentence. Moon taught that romantic love was the road to selfishness and ruin, so personal choice was stripped away on purpose. Those being matched even had to swear they were virgins. From the outside, it looked bizarre, but inside the church, it followed a very precise logic. And that logic was about blood. The church teaches that the fall of man wasn't a bite of forbidden fruit. It teaches that Eve was literally sexually seduced by Satan, and that ever since, all of humanity has been born into Satan's bloodline, carrying his sin in our very lineage. And in this belief, no amount of faith can wash that out. The only way to escape it is to have your bloodline itself changed. And that is where Moon and his wife, Hanakja, come in. They call themselves the true parents, a new sinless Adam and Eve sent to graft humanity back into God's pure lineage. To be married by them in that stadium was to have your blood, and the blood of every child you would go on to have, cleansed of original sin. The wedding wasn't a celebration of two people's love. To believers, it was a transfusion of the soul, blood, family, ancestors, salvation. Every strand of this belief pulled members in the same direction, toward giving and giving until there was nothing left. It was a doctrine that quietly converted a family's entire worth into the church's. So, all that money, gathered through the promise of a purified bloodline and a rescued family, where did it actually end up? Enormous sums of money went into building a massive structure called 천원궁. According to accounting documents one news outlet obtained, the total budget for the 천원궁 project was estimated at around 920 billion Korean won, somewhere near 700 million US dollars. And there was more. Other suspicions were that Han and the church's leadership were going on overseas gambling trips. Han was reportedly spotted at a casino in Las Vegas, and 12 members of the church leadership, Han among them, were said to have spent more than 60.9 billion Korean won, a figure close to 50 million US dollars, at casinos over a period of 4 years. Han reportedly told a special prosecutor that the trips were for rest, but for members who had given everything they owned to the church, it was a gut punch. And the shadow of this enormous kingdom didn't stop at religion. It extended, at last, into the world of politics. The suspicions that began in Japan finally erupted into a sweeping investigation in Korea. The Unification Church became the target of a special prosecutor's probe over alleged collusion between religion and the state. The allegation that politics and religion had become improperly entangled. And at the very top of that investigation stood the church's supreme leader, Hanakja. Eventually, Han was summoned by the special prosecutor for questioning, a marathon session that lasted 9.5 hours. When it was over, she emerged in a wheelchair. She faced 5 charges in total: violating the Political Funds Act, violating the Anti-Graft Law, violating the Political Parties Act, occupational embezzlement, and inciting the destruction of evidence. In the end, she was placed under arrest. Now, here's one thing I have to make clear. Parts of this have since been decided in court, but the case against Han herself is still ongoing, and much of what follows remains an allegation she denies. First, what prosecutors zeroed in on was the suspicion that church money had flowed into politics. At the center of it all was one figure, Yoon Young-ho, who once served as the church's head of world operations. He was known as one of Han's closest confidants, a man who, at one point, controlled the church's personnel and finances. Yoon Young reportedly testified that he personally handed 100 million Korean won, or roughly 75,000 US dollars of church money, to a lawmaker named Kwon Sung-dong. Prosecutors allege that the money was intended to buy the church a powerful ally inside the incoming government at a time when it was facing mounting legal pressure both in Korea and in Japan. The church was also suspected of handing over expensive gifts as a form of payoff. Prosecutors are examining whether Han gave the final sign-off on a roughly 80 million won, or around $60,000 worth of gifts delivered to then First Lady Kim Gun-hee. The implication was that donations members had given at great cost were being spent on luxury goods. On the receiving end, the courts have already reached a verdict. In April 2026, Kim Gun-hee, the former First Lady, was sentenced to 4 years in prison in a case covering stock manipulation and bribes she accepted from the Unification Church. Whether Han was the one who approved those gifts, though, is still being decided on her own trial. Those named in the other allegations strongly deny them. Lawmaker Kwon Sung-dong denied all charges and maintained his innocence. The church likewise said it had no involvement in any political collusion or political funding scheme, and that it would prove the truth in court. Han, too, reportedly denied most of the charges during the questioning, while, it said, repeatedly insisting that she is the only begotten daughter. While this investigation was underway, voices defending the church began rising in the United States, including Mike Pompeo, who served as both Secretary of State and CIA Director under the first Trump administration. In a short social media post, he called Korea's legal action against Han deeply troubling, framing it as a violation of religious freedom and a betrayal of the democratic principles Korea should stand for. And he wasn't alone. A string of mostly retired American politicians voiced similar concern about the probe. Analysts say there's a background to this. Over decades, the Unification Church has built real influence in American politics, developing steady ties to prominent figures, largely around the Republican Party. One example was shown at the 2025 International Religious Freedom Summit in Washington. Former House Speaker Newt Gingrich addressed Japan's move to shut down the church, warning by video message that its actions set a dangerous precedent. But the church doesn't just have allies. It is also the effective owner of the conservative outlet, the Washington Times, giving it a media platform in the US. Experts see all of this as a kind of international PR campaign, an attempt to reframe an investigation into the church as a form of religious persecution. Cornered in Korea, the church mobilized the American political network it had spent years cultivating and went on the counterattack. A case stemming from a single religious group had somewhere along the way ballooned into a massive issue, shaking the politics of two countries and drawing attention from a third. Looking back, this all began with those 2 gunshots in Japan. The violent actions of one man snowballed into an investigation revealing the toll of those enormous donations on members in Japan. In Korea, it revealed allegations of collusion between the Unification Church and the state. And now, it has expanded into a picture vast enough to reach the political establishment of the United States. The Pandora's box one man's death pried open exposed issue after issue, crossing one border after another. For his crime, Yamagami was sentenced to life in prison in early 2026, a ruling he has appealed. But there's still a great deal about the wider story left to uncover, and the full scale of the damage is unknown. One man was killed, countless people have given everything they have, and it isn't yet over. We can only wait and see what comes next. That is all for today. Thanks for watching.